Hammerland, we're about to exit Hammerland. It's been a year-long journey, and we've talked about exclusively the Frankenstein and Dracula Hammer films from the 1950s on up to 1974, which brings us to our last feature of this series, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Aaron Christensen of Horror 101 with Dr. AC. You asked me just before we started, am I going to spend the entire show beating up on this movie? And I frankly don't have the energy. I feel like this movie beat me up. I'm still licking my wounds and not sucking on precious blood nectar, just, licking wounds and passing out. Am I being too harsh on this movie, or where does this fall in the pantheon for you?
Well, I think we're going to have we'll have our discourse, because it is certainly unusual as far as fans of what Hammer fans have come to expect from the series, from movies in general. But I think it's seen at a distance and within context that there's a lot to appreciate there. And we'll see if you come around to actually appreciating it, or if you're just like, this was nonsense, because that was the general reception when it finally came out. It didn't come out in the States until 1978. Yeah,
wow.
Right. So it received when it was released in the US and in the Asian markets, it actually did quite well. But Warner Brothers, who co-produced the film, I think they were high on their success from The Exorcist, and they weren't necessarily thinking. I mean, Hammer was kind of small change at that point, and I don't think they were in any big hurry. So Warner Brothers, who had agreed to co-produce the film with the Shaw Brothers in Hong Kong, actually dropped their end of the American distribution deal, which was of key importance to the success of the film for Hammer. And in some ways, this film kind of sounded the death knell for Hammer. They did a couple other films beyond this. Actually, they did the film that they shot around the same time, also in Hong Kong, called Shatter, which did not do well. It was an action film, didn't do well at all. And it's a bit of a mess. You might say that this film is also a mess, but it's more of a fun mess. Apparently, Shatter. I mean, I've seen Shatter. Shatter is just kind of like a crime thriller with not a lot of thrills. And the last thing that came out of Hammer was their remake of Alfred Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes, which did zero business and kind of died on the vine ignominiously.
Let's start with the title of this, because I mistakenly thought that it was Dracula and the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, but no, it's just the Seven Golden Vampires. Do you know why they left? I mean, because Dracula is in this movie, not Christopher Lee, but they have, Count Dracula is the antagonist. Why leave him off the title? I mean, such a marquee character, especially for Hammer.
Right. And I don't know the answer to that, because in terms of the title, because as you say, he is part of the legacy. It originated as not a Dracula film, probably no surprise to you, because it seems like he is literally shoehorned into the film at the beginning and the end, and that is absolutely the case. It was written as a non-Dracula vampire film with Van Helsing. But Warner Brothers, those great renegers, they insisted that Dracula be included. And so the script was rewritten to accommodate Dracula and the whole switcheroo with Ka. And then Warner Brothers dropped it. So it's kind of like, oh, well, thanks a lot, guys.
Well, so we don't have Christopher Lee, as I mentioned, but we do have John Forbes Robertson as Dracula, making one of the weirdest debuts I think I've ever seen. As you mentioned, Ka is he's a high priest of the Seven Golden Vampires, which is this collection of bloodsuckers from China. He makes his way to Transylvania in 1804, and he's kind of going up this treacherous mountain. He makes his way to what I guess is Castle Dracula, and he finds this crypt with a giant D on it, just in case anyone was confused. crypt opens, Dracula does the Nosferatu rise from the grave, which is pretty cool. But then when you get a close up of him, he's wearing lipstick and he's got like these crazy owl eyebrows. I'm like, what? He looks like what Hal, not Hal Ashby. It looks like someone that I recognize, but like it just underscores how important Christopher Lee is to this part.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it's actually, I mean, it's no fault of John Ford Robinson, that, you know, like the Asian makeup artist decided to go a little flamboyant for our Dracula. And also that's not his voice. His voice is dubbed. So yeah, it's a little sad for our poor actor playing Dracula. It wasn't his first outing for Hammer. He appears in next month's offering, The Vampire Lovers, but he's also silent in that film. So I don't know that I've ever heard John Ford Robinson's voice. I know he was an active British TV star, and so, you know, he's done quite a bit of work. But as far as Hammer goes, these were not his two finest hours, shall we say.
Yeah. Now let's get to how Dracula works in this movie. It's a concept that I've never heard of before. Maybe there's something in the movie lore that, you know, can back this up. I think it's an interesting.
Nope, it's fresh invented just for this one.
Because it's an interesting idea, frankly.
Sure.
My eyebrows, my very non-owl eyebrows were raised when Dracula announces to Ka, okay, I'm going to come back with you, and you are going to be the way that I interact with the world out in the daylight. I'm going to take over your body, so I will be wearing your skin, but it'll be me underneath. Dracula can do that? If not, right? Why, or if he can do that, why hasn't he done that for the previous movies? And more importantly, why has no one picked up this kind of an interesting idea and done it in the decades since?
Oh no! I mean, again, I think it is an interesting idea. I like the fact that he can kind of take on somebody else's persona, and you know, basically impersonate them in order to wend his way into their midst. I mean, if you watch enough Godzilla movies like I have, you kind of, you know, get used to oh yeah, he's got a new superpower this week. And that's kind of how I felt about this one. But then again, I mean, that's only the tip of the batshit iceberg on this one, because, you know, this movie is everything you've never seen before. You know, I think the only constant is Peter Cushing showing up and acting somewhat like the Van Helsing we used to know. But even that's not the same.
Well, he is, you know, he's traveling, he's doing like a guest lecture. Where was it? I
love that he's lecturing the Chinese about their own history. It's like
yes, and I think that was it Chung King? Is that where was he lecturing? Some
yes,
university. Okay.
Yes.
All right. I like that too, because it's almost like I wish they had done more with this idea in the movie. The idea that he is lecturing the Chinese on their own history, but it's partially because from his point of view, it is history. To them, it's just a legend. It's history in the context of old folk tales that people used to tell each other and are gradually passing out of existence because they're more, you know, science and logic minded, and vampires are not scientific or logical unless you've actually fought them. What's interesting is that when we catch up with Professor Van Helsing, a few things. One, it's 100 years later. This is now 1904. So I don't know what Ka/Dracula has been doing. Maybe it took him 100 years to walk from Transylvania back to China and set up shop. But we also find out that Van Helsing's been getting a little busy in the last, say, 30 years. He's got a son.
Well, I mean, that's not, I mean, Dracula 1972 AD, he had a granddaughter. So, I mean, that had to come from somebody.
Now, well, is this in continuity from that?
I can't imagine it is. I'm just saying it's not the first time we've seen evidence that, you know, Van Helsing has a sex life.
You know what? You're right. I think the difference for me is that this is more of a direct thing. Like I can imagine For me, like grandkids are just something that kind of happens.
It
Whereas
just
like
happened. Let me explain to you, Ian, how this works.
the bats and the bees. But no, so they don't really make a big deal out of it. Like what happened to the mother? Usually in these kinds of movies is like, oh, she was attacked by a vampire or she left
Right.
because I was obsessed or something like that. But
Right.
no, it's just, he's got a son who's kind of going around with him. I get the feeling he's sort of in the family business, but not really. I'm going to confess, I tuned out a lot during this movie. The temptation to grab my phone and answer that text or to scroll through like what's going on Twitter just overpowered me as if I were under the spell of a vampire. So it's entirely possible a lot of the questions that I have about this movie were answered, but it just came. My kids have been watching a lot of Peanuts, like Snoopy lately, and the wah 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 wah. There's a lot of that for me in this movie. That's not to say I hated it, because there are some undeniably cool things that happen, but they all seem to happen within the last 10 minutes when I'm done anyway.
Okay. Well, so, I mean, the reason why we should also just kind of like, this basically turns into an action film because we have a whole lot of kung fu fighting going on when Cushing falls in with, I'm blanking on our hero's name.
I think I'm going to pronounce it. I think it's Shi Ching. It's HSI Ching. I think
you like how I threw you under the bus there? Nice job.
I appreciate it. The treads are doing wonders for my hair. But no, I think Ching is actually his first name, if I have it correctly. And I think Shi is supposed to be his family name, because I'm pretty sure he refers to it because he yells a lot at this guy, like Ching, like watch out.
Right. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So we'll call him Ching.
Yes.
But Ching has his brothers who are all versed in various martial arts, and it is their sworn duty to defend the world from the 7 golden vampires. And Cushing, Ching comes to visit Van Helsing when he's lecturing because he wants to enlist his help. And again, I think that was what Michael Carreras, who was running Hammer at the time, and to be fair, the vein was running dry, as we've mentioned in previous installments, that things were not going well for Hammer. Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. I mean, it was just a new era for horror.
Yeah, and
they didn't necessarily know where they landed, so they were kind of throwing anything at the wall and seeing what stuck. Also, Warner Brothers was not keen on coughing up a lot of money, and so they went to the Shaw Brothers in Hong Kong because they were willing to help finance the film. And so it was partially born of necessity, but also I think they were seizing on the exploitation of, Bruce Lee had just become a huge hit in overseas in Enter the Dragon and The Chinese Connection and Fist of Fury. So, like the Kung Fu craze, the martial arts craze was in full swing at this time. And I think had it been released in the US during that time, it would have done brisker business because there's a lot of action. There's a lot of fights between the family Ching and all of the golden vampires and their various zombie minions. So I'm kind of like I wonder if you tuning out was because you've seen a fair number of chopsaki at this point, and perhaps it wasn't the novelty it might have been when it was initially released.
Well, it's funny you mention that because the last month on the Spoiler Room podcast, which I do Tuesdays with Mark Krawczyk, we're rounding out a year of canon films. And this month, almost exclusively, except for the list this past week, we were covering the Ninja Ninja trilogy.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Not American Ninja, but Enter the Ninja,
Yep.
Ninja 3, The Domination, and the second one was Revenge of the Ninja. So all three, well, the third one, not so much, but the first two, I think, are quite remarkable. And the first time I'd seen them, and the action is so incredibly staged and just inventive and integral to the story that when I'm watching what's happening in this movie, it just felt like they were writing like vampire lore and journey, and then all of a sudden, insert fight scene here.
I don't think you're wrong. I will say that, I mean, I think that the fights are certainly serviceable.
Yeah, they're serviceable. I think that's the problem. Is it's not that I was burned out on martial arts action. It's just that I've been so accustomed to seeing it done really well that to just watch what looked like people kind of swinging around. And this is not to take away from the choreography, because there's no way I could have done it. There is an artistry to this. It's just there's different degrees. Just like when you watch any action film, there are diehard knockoffs, and then there's diehard.
Right. That's there. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's part of it, is this context of, when we watch the old wire fu, classics from the 70s, and then you look at something like The Matrix, you're like, well, okay, or even Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where things just get stepped up to a next level, and you go, okay, this is what you were trying to do way back then. And I feel like, I feel like the fights that we see here are serviceable. They do the job. And, for my part, I was fine with it, but I think you're right. You do have to kind of look at it through a historical context lens and realize, okay, this is not the be all end all, especially for eyes that are, 45 years older.
Right. And the thing is, like, the ninja movies came out, like a decade or a little under a decade from this movie. So it's unfair to say, well, this isn't nearly as good as what was going to come in the future. What were you thinking?
Right.
But I will say that part of the problem, and this is something I mentioned the last 5 or 10 minutes, it was actually a little bit longer than that, but I was missing, much like vampires, I was missing stakes. It's just like this, once you establish this invincible kind of group of 7 brothers and a sister or whatever to rise up and fight the vampire menace, they've all got their individual weapons and specialties. It's very Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles kind of stuff, but they're traveling
what if
through
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was inspired by this film? What if
Ninja Turtles would still be better, but but no, there's a journey. That the conceit is this village that is sort of the central location of this vampire temple where the 7 vampires hang out, is a mystery. No one knows where it is. No one believes it exists, but Ching and his family bloodline, they know where it is. And they're kind of the keepers of it, I guess. And they lead Van Helsing, if I have this correctly, and his son and this lady named Vanessa, who's like the sort of world traveler, kind of the prototypical, like independent, tough traveling woman. I mean, that was kind of neat to see in this film. And she's great. And that's kind of the tragedy at the end, not tragedy in that I was disappointed. I was kind of sad the way that things kind of end up for her, but there were some nice little surprises. But they end up traveling this great distance to try and find this secret village, and along the way they keep getting ambushed by these vampires, and there's a fight, and a bunch of the vampires get staked or zombied or whatever, and they run off, and then it just kind of happens again and again. And Van Helsing and his son, and even Vanessa, they have a strict pattern too. The vampire menace shows up, the good guys with their weapons spring into action, and our main heroes, the people who've been carrying this series, or at least the spirit of the series for movies and movies, they're just kind of hanging back watching, like, oh, what's going on over there, until randomly they decide to like grab a gun or like a stake and then get involved. It's the same pattern. I never understand why. It's almost like they're contractually obligated, like, okay, Peter Cushing, I'm not really the star of this movie. It's those guys over there. Oh, now I get okay, I'm going to spring into action.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, it's a mashup in the truest sense, in that you're trying to put 2 different things together. And I'm not saying that it works. I think that it's a noble effort, and that they are trying to make 2 things, the novelty of it. I think they were hoping that it would surprise people, it would entertain people. And, as I was watching it for the 3rd time, I think it's 3rd or 4th time I've seen it now, like I think I get a little I get a little softer on it each time, where I'm like, yeah, like it is what it is, and you're either going to like it or not. But I think when you first encounter it, you're going to be like, what is even happening right now? Like, how did anybody ever think this was going to work? And so it may or may not work, but I think for Hammer fans, it's one that it might grow on you.
And I gotta say, I completely understand where you're coming from, because not so much when it was over, but actually during this conversation, I was thinking, I think this is going to be better a second time. And partially that is because in that last climactic battle, where it is kind of like the Wild Bunch with vampires, you've got an unending horde seemingly of the undead coming at our protagonists. Our protagonists start getting, taken out left and right. And there's this one scene where two of the brothers, I think they get bitten and one gets his hand cut off or something, and they kind of die by like making the fist pact, kind of like Schwarzenegger and Carl Weathers in Predator, and they fall over dead. I was oddly moved by that moment, even though I didn't know who the hell those guys were. I couldn't tell if they were the spear guys or the axe guys. But I feel like watching it a second time, like, oh, those are the okay, yeah.
I mean, well, okay. In that, I think that is one thing, that there's too many characters on the good guy's side, and that Cushing carries his own weight, literally from the series. I mean, this is the 5th time he's played Van Helsing, and he's been doing Hammer at this point for 15 years. So, I mean, he is, he's an established figure, but I mean, we don't really get to know his son. We don't really get to know Julie Edge, who plays the female lead, Vanessa, and Ching. I think David Chang plays Ching, but it's like even his sister, who becomes the love interest for the young Van Helsing. She doesn't get to do much other than be, the fighting tigress or the shy and retiring Lily, and. I feel like that's part of the problem, is that we don't, I think, referring back to the stakes you were talking about, we don't really get an investment in these characters because there's so many of them. It's very spread out. And it doesn't feel like Van Helsing has very serious stakes either. It feels like there is kind of a general wash of good versus evil. I will say, on the flip side, however, that I think the cinematography is really kind of fun. It's shot in CinemaScope, which is what most of the Shaw Brothers kung fu epics were shot in. So it's this magnificent, widescreen adventure. I love the colored gels that are used in the Vampire Lair. Of these, like, straight out of a Bava film, where you've got just these huge green shafts of light with red. And I mean, I feel like it's just very vibrant. And I believe this is the first time in any of the Dracula films. It's not the first time that Hammer's done nudity, but it's the first time in a Dracula film that we've had this extent of nudity, where we have like the topless maidens all around the bubbling cauldron of blood. Like I say, I think they were just throwing like all the exploitation elements they could at it. There's a lot more blood flying in this movie than any other. I mean, there's one where there's like a legit gurgle of blood coming out, and I was like, wow, this is quite a juicy stuff going on.
Literally. I love the Vampire Lair. I wasn't so crazy about the 7 golden vampires themselves, because when you get close up on them, the one guy looked like his fangs were literally like drawn
Painted
onto his face. Yeah. And they all had this kind of like a mushy, it was almost like the Frankenstein movie where they had the fake Frankenstein face in the very beginning, the mask. It looked like that, but a little bit more beaten up. But yeah, the production design was great. There was the giant cauldron of the vat of blood, and then the 7 kind of maidens tied up and screaming. That was kind of cool. The nudity bothered me, because it's one thing to see, topless women, being held captive in like a ceremony or something. That's not surprising. But there are a couple of different raids on various villages where I'm assuming they're getting, villagers to turn into minions or vampires or whatever. But they make it a point of, and they're all like, Asian women running around. of doing the thing where they get attacked, but they're just like, they have their shirts ripped off so you can see their boobs hanging out. And I'm like, this felt very, I know it's like exploitation, but it felt almost like Asian exoticism in this weird way. Like, hey, fans over in the States, you haven't seen this a lot because, it's still the early 70s. So this is kind of, I imagine, kind of cutting edge. It just made me feel a little bit queasy. And even the relationship, it's nice to see that it wasn't just Van Helsing Jr. and Vanessa, kind of falling for each other, because you get that sense early on that they're going to end up a couple, because that's just kind of the way things go in these movies. But, Vanessa ends up falling for Ching, and then Leyland ends up falling for Ching's sister. And so there's that kind of an element to it. It's nice, but again, these Asian characters are not given enough or nearly as much focus and attention as some of even the B tier love interests from previous Hammer movies that we've seen. Right. So again, it just feels like almost like people as set dressing, people as an exploitative element. And that's fine. We were talking about, violence for the sake of violence, but, Asians for the sake of Asians. I just can't quite get behind that. But again, I'm looking at this through 2021 goggles and not necessarily 1974. Sure.
And I mean, no doubt that they are doing an exploitation. I mean, like they are, I think you're right, that it is, you've never taken a Hammer film to, China before. So let's do that. And they are, exotic. So let's, exploit that. I mean, I think that's exactly what it was. And I think that was its intention, was to be, to exploit these new elements and see what what the fans would respond to. And again, it did great business in the UK and in the Asian markets. By the time, I mean, you think about it, by the time it got to the States, not only was Hammer dead, but the Kung Fu craze was over. It really just it never had a chance. Plus, it was released by one half of the Amicus team. There was Rosenberg and Sabatsky, and Rosenberg was the one who put this one out. And, Warner, he had created his own distribution arm, but he did not have like the power of like a Warner Brothers. So it was released to like drive-ins. Plus, this is another fun fact. This film, I think, runs around like 86 minutes or so. The version that Rosenberg put out, he chopped up, and it went out about 70 minutes long. Whoa. And made even less sense than this one does. And I mean, he chopped it so much that he had to go back and take scenes and repeat fight scenes to kind of pad it back out again over an hour. So it was really a mess, the version that he put out. And that was the version that was released. And I don't think the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires is, as it was originally created, I don't think that saw distribution until it was on DVD in the 2000s. So this film has really never gotten a fair shake in the US. And it's nice that Shout Factory put it out. I think it was last year or the year before. And the commentary track with Bruce G. Hallenbeck is, I'm basically repeating a lot of the stuff that he talks about, because he does kind of provide a really nice context for, and maybe that's why I'm a little more generous to the film than I might have been when I first saw it. Because again, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, this was never, ever going to work. I don't know what they were thinking. But I think, had it come out at the time it was intended to come out, maybe it would have been looked on, at least in a more kitsch entertainment, in a more kitsch entertainment vein. That's the thing. I think we've seen some excellent Hammer films in both Dracula and in Frankenstein over this year that we've been talking about these movies, to the point where, and I've mentioned this, how many more of these movies can you make until the formula goes stale? And I am constantly surprised by these little twists and turns and tweaks of the formula that make these fantastic movies. I feel like this is the case. There is a great, not just a good movie or a better movie. I think there's a great movie in The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. I just think you need
someone to make that today, more flesh out the characters more. It just looks kind of, I know it is beautifully shot, but it does look kind of cheap, like they're wandering around the same deserts they're using in Star Trek practically, looking for this village. But that's fine. I want to get to this climactic fight where everything goes to hell. Has the quickest vampire transformation I think I've ever seen on film. Vanessa, and we'll talk about it. I don't think me or us discussing it takes away the impact of watching the way that the scene is executed. I think it's really well done. Vanessa is attacked by a vampire, gets bitten in the throat. Ching sees this, but she's able to kind of conceal it with her hair until he gets like right up on her, and then she smiles at him and then attacks him. And from the time that she gets bit to the point where she's attacking him is maybe a minute. It's instantaneous, and it's kind of jarring, but they were kind of in love with each other, and he was so horrified by what she had become and the fact that he was attacked, that he rammed himself through with he rammed her through with a stake, and then he impales himself on that same stake, and they die in each other's arms. And I'm like, this is beautiful.
I think that, that is definitely one of the signature points in this film, that kind of double impaling. I thought you were going to make your Friday the 13th reference there, but I'm a little disappointed.
Don't be, because I have a separate one for this movie.
Okay, excellent. That was close. But yes, it's very much the climactic battle. And to your point, I don't think that I think this may be the first time that we never even see the character who is transformed, like, even blink. Like 1 second you think she's totally fine, and then suddenly she's wielding these enormous fangs. But I really love the poetry of him impaling her and then impaling himself. And as you said, is it grief, or is it the fact that he knows that he's been bitten? What's interesting about that, though, and I didn't notice it until this last viewing, is that she, like, her bite marks disappear after the head vampire is vanquished.
Mm-hmm.
Whereupon, like, he wouldn't have been transformed, right?
Well, because she bit him, right, and then he impaled.
Right, but if the vampire bit her and then she bit him, but her powers disappear because the vampire is dead, doesn't that mean that he's going to be fine? So he must be just killing himself out of grief.
Right, but he might not have known all of those rules, right? About,
Well, he deliberately watches the bite marks disappear, which I always think is goofy. I'm like, what, the bite parts disappear?
It's magic. No, I didn't pick up on that. I thought that and again, I might have been fresh off of checking my phone. I'm like, what? Oh, something good is happening. I thought the bite marks.
I'm glad you saw it.
Me too. No, I just assumed that the bite marks disappearing were something that was meant for us, and not necessarily something that Ching saw and noticed. Because you're right. I think if he had seen that, I don't think he would have been.
Well, he is, just to be clear, he is consciously watching it disappear. He reacts to it.
Right.
And then impales himself.
Right. But that's the thing, is he doesn't strike me as the kind of guy that, he's been around, he's lost people before, he's been in this, kind of vampire war. He strikes me as there's more fish in the sea type of guy.
Right. You would think. So, but anyway, and then, we're kind of left with the Dracula facing off against Van Helsing one last time. And
as we've seen there's been many one last times in this quote unquote series.
And I like that he decides that he has to transform back into not Christopher Lee in order to do this showdown.
which is weird because there is a transformation scene and there's sort of a middle state, but I couldn't tell what I was looking at. It's partially
Right.
shrouded in smoke, but I couldn't tell if I was looking at like a lumpy, fleshy mass, kind of like the Thing mid transformation, or if it was
You were
an outfit. Yeah, I didn't know what I was looking at, but
I was like, it's because I like the initial transformation where Dracula turns into Ka. I feel like that's actually kind of a fun,
the little turntable with smoke effect.
Mm-hmm,
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was like, this, well, I mean, for fans of Frank Langella's Dracula, like where you have the light show and things whipping around, it's like, okay, they might have just been watching this. But yeah, and that said, I think that Dracula's disintegration in this film is worthy of note. He gets impaled on an iron stake. He gets an iron stake through the heart. And then we've seen, Dracula dissolve before, dating all the way back to the first one, where he turns to dust when Van Helsing forces him into the sun. And here, he gets the stake through the heart and he basically disintegrates. And then there's this great moment where the stake, because there's no longer a body around to hold it up, falls and like cracks the skull in half and shatters it. I was like, that's really a nice moment.
It is. It
They're
felt like
nice moments. Yeah, they're nice moments in a not great movie. I get it.
Well, no, I just in terms of that scene, it felt to me like they realized this was the last movie they were going to make with Dracula, and so they had to draw out the disintegration sequence. I feel like they cut back to it like 10 times, like, yes, it's the greatest hits of Dracula melting, going all the way back through the horn. I don't need to watch it for a full minute of screen time. Plus, they did the thing where, like, the puffy eyes that almost look like cartoon eyes.
Yeah,
and the
they
fangs.
they collapse into his head.
Sure. I was just gobsmacked that for as much as Dracula sheds the Ka persona and manifests as himself again, within half a minute he's got a stake through his heart again. There's like no fight. It was like, that's super easy. And I think that gets back to another problem, which is it felt like the Dracula at the beginning and at the end, which, as you mentioned, they do feel like bookends. When we see Ka throughout the entire middle portion of the film, when he's presiding over the 7 vampires, or he's doing whatever he's doing, I never saw Dracula like pulling strings. I just saw Ka. I would love to have known, like, do the other vampires know that that's Count Dracula? Would there be any sense of betrayal if they found out that wasn't the high priestess, that he'd been hijacked? Literal like cultural appropriation. There's a whole other movie that I would rather be watching.
I hear you. This is the one you get, though.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. Like, I think Hammer fans, like, once they accepted that this is what it is, I think going back to it again, my fondness for it has grown over the years. I think I saw it as kind of the train wreck that that I perceived it to be at the beginning, and now I'm kind of like, oh no, it is what it is. It's it's a wild ride with a lot of disparate elements all tossed together. It's a an Asian Gothic horror.
Yeah, we can't let this end without mentioning the Friday the 13th connection. You thought it was gonna be the double impaling, which comes from Friday the 13th Part 2, as does my reference. There's a scene where our merry band of heroes is sitting around a campfire, and Van Helsing is kind of like telling stories about what they're up against, and that struck me very much like I got to give you straight. I don't want to scare anyone, but I'm going to give it to you straight about Jason scene from Part 2. Unfortunately, no one comes racing in through the fire in a giant fright wig and a spear at the end, but you can't have everything, I guess. So I'm gonna put you on this one. I'm gonna throw you under the bus, AC. Great. You did this to me on our last Hammerland, our last Academia Giallo conversation. Hammerland, this year-long journey we've been on, what has been the highlight or the big surprise for you as far as the movies we watched?
Gosh. If we're going to look back at all of them, like Frankenstein and the Draculas, I think I was pleasantly surprised by. I liked I don't know if anything, I was surprised by how much I was kind of not as entranced by Frankenstein, the Monster from Hell. I feel like I'm more forgiving to this film, the Seven Golden Vampires, and less forgiving to Monster from Hell than I've been in the past. As far as like gems, I think, it's always a pleasure to go back and revisit Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, since it is my favorite, remains my favorite. I actually I felt like I was a little kinder on Evil of Frankenstein this time around, even though it's definitely not one of my favorites. Yeah, I think that was the surprise, is that Evil of Frankenstein was usurped by Monster from Hell as my least favorite.
Wow. Well, glad we could do that for you. No, I'm sad to say this is kind of the same thing that happened with Academia Giallo, is we've watched so many of these movies over this course of this year that I'm amazed that you can differentiate them based on title. I think with very few exceptions, I've loved just about everything that we've watched. And this one we're talking about is an exception, but to your point, I think I need to give it another shot, probably, and some distance too. But it just goes back to the idea of, when I first started this talking to you, I had no idea that the movies were going to be so varied and have such rich characters and ideas, 3 or 4 sequels deep. I love the idea of, Dracula kind of his influence taking over these kind of rich, townspeople and turning them, their evil, turning into like the curse that, he's pulling strings, but he's not getting necessarily involved until the end. I love Victor Frankenstein and just his descent into madness. We see him as like a precocious teen boy. And then, to my mind, when he gets carried into the burning house by his own creation, that's where that should have stopped. But unfortunately, there's a whole other movie afterwards, a movie I really liked, but as far as a fitting end, I think it came one movie earlier than it should have.
Did you have a favorite Dracula film?
Again, I don't know that I could answer that. I do. I just can't remember which the title of it. Damn it.
Was it the one with Dracula? I guess like I have a very soft spot for Brides of Dracula.
I was going to say that was a good one. And I think that was more buoyed by the kind of the supporting characters and the kind of interpersonal drama of what was going on in that castle, the kind of the almost like slashery elements to that, rather than what was going on with our main, knockoff nephew vampire, whatever it was supposed to be.
Baron Meinster.
Right. How do you remember all this stuff, man?
It helps if you watch it, 6 times.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I mean, and I think, as is the case with many of these franchises, like the first is the best for me with the Draculas. I really like Horror of Dracula. It is funny that, like it's the fifth Frankenstein that ended up being my favorite though. Like, I feel like the first Frankenstein is good, and the second one is good, and the third one has some dodgy elements, and the fourth one is good, and then the third and the fourth and fifth it is the fifth. Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed is the fifth one. Wow.
Yeah, it's a tribute to this studio, and one of the things that we've talked about, not so much in this movie, is the production design. And the care that goes into creating these fully realized worlds, whether you're talking about Dracula or Frankenstein. It's a beautiful thing, and I'm sad to see us come to an end of Hammerland, but we're not leaving Hammerland behind, because starting next month, in fact, we're going to be talking about more Hammer movies. Yes, I'm proud to present, I don't have a logo to unveil yet, but we're going to be doing Son of Hammerland.
Oh my!
Breathtakingly original. And doesn't make any sense because Hammerland is a place, and I don't know how it can have a son, but maybe we'll find out. And we're going to kick things off next year with the just released from Scream Factory, a movie that neither of us have seen, and only one of us has right now, The Vampire Lovers, which looks very intriguing, and Peter Cushing is in that. But explain to me why we're not talking about that in Hammerland Year One? Why is this not a Dracula or Frankenstein movie?
Well, first off, I have seen that film many times,
Well,
but we haven't seen this. We haven't seen this new Blu-ray yet.
yes, yes,
Yeah, so we're saying this will be your first time seeing it, though, right?
yes. Mm-hmm.
So, it is actually an adaptation of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which is a vampire story that I believe predates Dracula, if I'm not mistaken.
Really?
But it is a female vampire, and where it's important for Hammer is that it was the first time that we saw. Well, I think it may have been the first time we had nudity. We have actual female nudity, and it's 1970. So it's still kind of pretty racy stuff happening, and it is led by the inimitable Ingrid Pitt, who just makes such an impression in this film. She went on to do a couple of other things, Countess Dracula for Hammer. She's in The Wicker Man, and but she's just she also did The House of Drip Blood. But anyway, I'm a huge. You become an instantaneous Ingrid Pitt fan when you watch this film. But yes, it's a completely separate. And Hammer did three films, the Karnstein trilogy. She is Carmilla Karnstein, but then they did a sequel called Lust for a Vampire, and then the final one is Twins of Evil. And I hope that we will tackle the Karnstein trilogy over the course of next year, because I think after you see Vampire Lovers, you'll want a little bit more.
Well, I'm excited because that was a hell of an endorsement. And I kind of want to watch this right now, but as we've discussed, my memory is nothing. So I'd have to watch it like probably the day before we actually talk about it in January. So I do want to thank you again. I can't thank you enough for being my guide through Hammerland. This has been, even though I can't remember the names of the movies to save my life, this has been one of the most rewarding, I think, first time movie experiences I've had. And I just want to evangelize Hammer to everyone. To quote Bill Murray in Scrooged, I get it now. And I'm happy to say that.
Yeah, it's actually thrilling to take somebody through an entire franchise that they've never seen before. That was actually really fun. Like there are times where I may have seen a film or two, but these are films that I've, really grown to love over the past, 2 decades. It's really, it's been a joy watching you kind of like discover them alongside, because it's an opportunity for me to watch them afresh.
Awesome. Well, we'll be doing more fresh views next year, and I think we'll kick off with that Karnstein trilogy. Is that it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's a weird last name. It sounds almost like they're trying to incorporate Frankenstein in there somehow.
I won't say that they weren't, but I believe she's Carmilla Karnstein in the book as well. So Sheridan Le Fanu may have been trying to borrow from Mary Shelley.
Let me ask you this as a parting question. Has there ever been a Frankenstein vampire movie?
I don't think so.
Like what if Victor Frankenstein robbed a grave, but it was actually a crypt of a vampire crypt and incorporated into his creature?
Well, I will say there have been Frankenstein Dracula mashups, and there have been times where Dracula will visit Dr. Frankenstein.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about.
No, I know you're talking like the Frankenstein monster gets bit by a vampire, right?
Or is comprised of vampire parts somehow.
Ooh, oh, see, get that pen out right now.
I won't even tell you, like, here's an idea that'll blow everybody's mind, or maybe it'll just blow. What if Victor Frankenstein finds a way to create a body out of the Frankenstein monster, Dracula, the Wolfman, and the Invisible Man?
That would be amazing. We could have just like a patchwork of monsters.
Yes. In fact, that's what you call
the movie.
That's the title.
Done. That's the title right there.
All right.
Trademark that.
We will. I'll cut you in for 10%.
Perfect.
No. All right. Thank you again, AC. Happy New Year. And I'm really looking forward to the next leg of our Hammerland exploration.
Thank you. Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for riding along with us.
All right. Take care. I'm pulling the carriage over. We're going to take a break and get some refreshments. And then we got miles and miles and miles to go before we sleep.
True.
Later.